Oh, hey there. Carlos Kidman here. And actually in this QAP Weekly class, I got to present around API, automation and testing with Python. Now, I go right into the notebook here at the beginning of the video, so my recommendation is to look at the description below to check out all the links that we use for the Colab notebook, for our open source knowledge base, for the repos and things I'm going to be showing in the video. So make sure you check that out, click on those links, follow along, and have yourself a great time. With that said, let's jump right in, because this is a good one, y'all. So in Google Colab, you have these cells. And there's two types of cells. You have a text cell and you have a code cell. So you can see here, if I click text, you get a text cell and you can do any markdown is valid, right? And you can see like, hey, look, valid. You can move things around. You can delete them. It's very interactive, very, very nice. And then you have code cells that you can actually execute. So I'd like everyone to start with the first one. If you hover over it, you click this play button and it runs this line. This part's going to take a little bit of time because the notebook is going to initialize. You're actually going to get connected to a cloud container that exists in GCP. It will be a CPU, and it's fairly strong. But the cool thing about Google Colab is they also give you access to free GPUs and TPUs, which is pretty darn necessary when you're working with real machine learning stuff. But anyway, so it's just cool that it's that free, and it's, yeah, really, really cool. So I recommend trying it out, playing with it, especially as you're learning stuff. So web API automation, we're going to do it with Python because I'm a Python fiend. I love me some Python. So I believe we were going to do Java last time. And I found out this morning that I was going to be the one running it. So I said, well, I can spin something up real quick, but it won't be in Java, that's for sure. So I hope you're not disappointed. All the concepts we're going to talk about all work with any language you're using. So don't worry too much about that. So we're going to go through this notebook. There's going to be some challenges where I'm going to essentially pause and people will work on challenges for like 5 minutes on your own, see if you can solve it. And then we'll work together on a solution. And then once we're done with that, I want to talk about an opportunity that someone approached me from LinkedIn on, saying, hey, I have 6 to 10 open positions I'm trying to fill for entry-level people, for mid, for seniors, all ranging from like $65,000 to $125,000 salary. Here in Utah. And so I wanted to talk about that and make sure that you're aware. But anyway, so let's get started. So when you ran this first one, like I said, it should have taken a little bit of time, but you should have requests imported now. Requests is the main library that we use in Python to work with APIs. There's other things that you can put with it or other libraries, but requests is like the most common and it's very easy to use in Python. So if you're going to do Python automation with APIs, you're probably just going to use requests. With things like JavaScript, you'll have other ones with like Axios or Fetch. For testing, you might use like supertest in JavaScript. Like there's a whole bunch of different libraries for working with APIs, and each language will have its own like subset of libraries that they use. But just know that for Python, we use requests. As we go through this as well, please, please, please either write messages inside of the chat or come off mute and just start talking. That's okay. You can interrupt me. All right, here we go. So diving in, the Deck of Cards API. In this section, we will use the open source Deck of Cards API to show how you use requests. That gives you this website right here. Because it's open source, so completely free as well. And it just gives you face cards. That's all it does. You create decks and you do stuff with the cards in the deck, and bada bing, bada boom. So if you're familiar with APIs, this entire doc page thing should just read very nicely. It should be pretty easy to consume. But if not, well, we're about to jump into it. So the first thing we're going to do is to create a new shuffled deck. Now you can just run this and you'll see that we have a status code here. That's where this print is. Print the status code and print what the response.json is, and we get this back. All right, and this is going to be very close to what they have in the documentation as well, where we see right here, the response looks kind of like that. So same format, right? The same shape of the data. Now, what I want to show is this first line. This first line is how you hit that endpoint. You use requests, you put in an action method like get, and then you put in the URL you want to hit. From there, you hold the response in a variable, and you can do whatever you want with that response. And that's it. That's how you do it. All right. class is over. That's how you do Python stuff. Any questions?
So if you have this, and if there is like you need to authenticate something, do you just pass that into the request.get with like a token?
Yeah, and we will actually, I will show an example of that exact scenario.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so
I do everything in JavaScript, so it's weird not to see .thens within .thens to get your requests. So yeah. This is cool.
Yeah, it's pretty nice. And I would hope that if you're using JavaScript, you just use like a wait, like async and await instead of the .then, because yeah, that's a lot of .thens and lots of
yeah.
Like,
well, it's with Cypress, so you can't do awaits.
Oh, all right.
But that's for another complaint.
Yeah. So. Okay, so what I want to do here now is, yes, this is how easy it is to do it inside of Python. Obviously, this is a very simple example. And so we're going to keep going into more difficult, more complex things, and then you'll have yourself a challenge. But I want to start off with the anatomy of a request. Because again, this is not Python specific. This is just dealing with web APIs. So the first thing is an action method, right? And if you're familiar with like CRUD operations, you'll kind of know what I'm talking about, right? But you have things like get, post, update, delete. There's a whole bunch of them. Inside of Postman, if you actually click on this menu here, you see a ton. Like all of these things are different action methods. And a good 50% of them you'll probably never use. But these main ones, the get, post, put, patch, delete, these main ones are probably the ones you'll use like 95% of the time. But it's just good to be aware that, yeah, in a request, you have to include an action method. For Python, that's what this was for. So we were doing a get action against this endpoint. Very nice, very nice. So for example, get a list of users, or post, AKA create a new shuffled deck. We then have the URL. This is the URL to hit, or to call. I always say hit, but I'm not like literally hitting, my computer. But you pass in this URL for what is the address that you want to hit, that we're sending this get action to, and that server is going to return a response back to us, and that's what this response here is. So you include the action method and the URL, and then any other arguments, any other arguments that the endpoint requires. So a good example of this would be like a headers object for authorization. Emily, just for you, we'll get there soon. Or you may want to add a body as well, because you're creating something in the database. So there's different arguments, and we'll see some examples of this soon. The next bit is the anatomy of a request URL. So this is the URL to not to create a deck. This is to draw cards from a deck. Again, right in here, you can see all this information. I'm just pulling it from here. So this is the next part, drawing some cards. That's this section. So drawing cards, this is the URL. But there's some extra pieces here, right? We have this thing here that looks kind of funky. We have this thing here that looks kind of funky as well. So WTF, let's go over the anatomy. So the first part is the base URL. This is the base or root that all requests are going to use. So in this case, this is essentially the base. The deckofcardsapi.com/API. And it's also very common to see APIs be versioned. Like here's version 1 of the cards API. Here's version 2 of the cards API. Version 3, right? You may have like version 1 is just a regular deck of cards. Version 2, they decide to give you like 10 different themes. So here's like the Zelda deck, right? So it's a regular face cards, but with like Zelda pictures instead. Who knows, right? So you usually have version APIs. Right, the next thing would be the route or the path of the API. In this case, that would be the /deck with this part. This is the route or address of the endpoint you want to hit. And it's also very common for an API to have many routes. In this case, there's only one real specific route. It's the deck route. Everything we see is going to use this deck route. So you'll see after API, it's /deck again, /deck again, /deck, all the way through. So there's really only one route in this entire API, but it's common for APIs to have multiple. And again, we'll see an example of this later. From there, you have path variables. In this case, this is a path variable. It's an argument that has to be included. You have to give it a value, and it's inside of the path, right, that we just talked about. So hence the name. It's a path variable because it exists in the path. Rocket science. That's what this is. Next up, we have a query variable, which is also known as parameters or params. So I'm going to switch over to Postman to illustrate this a little bit better. So here is the get request for creating a new shuffle deck. When I pasted it in, Postman automatically added this as the key and as the value in this param section. So Postman identified, hey, you have some query parameters, and here they are. It's after the question mark. Very nice. Switching back. Don't want to go too fast in case people have questions. There's no questions. I assume that y'all just like, Carlos, go faster. This is the easy stuff. All right. And as you can see, these all start right after the question mark. So you'll have a question mark at the end of the URL, and everything past that will say like count equals 2, deck ID equals this, fruit equals that, like whatever it is, you're going to have a lot of them. And just one single question mark that tells you this is the endpoint itself, and everything after the question mark, these are your query parameters. So any questions on either the anatomy of the request itself or the request URL?
You always have to have the question mark right after, or?
If it's a query variable,
Uh-huh.
almost always yes.
Okay.
I say almost always because it does depend if you're using like GraphQL or gRPC, but for like a REST API, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Do you have an example that shows multiple query parameters?
Not right now, no.
Okay.
But it would just be like, and the next one, and the next one, and it would just keep going. All right, moving on. So on to the first challenge, y'all. Woo! So in this challenge, you must use data from the first response in the next request. So to draw cards from a deck, you have to give an actual, like a valid deck ID. You can't just send this or else it'll fail. So what I want you to do is let's take 10 minutes max, run this cell. This is going to get you a new shuffle deck. And there we go. There's our deck right there. This is the deck ID. We want to use this deck ID in the next request. So you need to fill in this cell with the code to make it work. Oh, snappity snaps. Now, if you don't know Python, that shouldn't be a disadvantage anyway, because it's all kind of the same thing. Like it's going to look kind of like this. So if you have questions, come off mute, ask. That's totally okay. We can share your screen even, whatever. I'm going to give you 5-10 minutes, get as far as you possibly can to try and draw 3 cards from the deck, and then assert that there's 3 cards drawn.
On the assert is, since we're using that cards object, is cards.count a valid method that I can use?
In Python, no. There's another way to get the length of items.
Coming from C# and JavaScript, I wasn't aware of the length method, which is len, in case anyone else was struggling with the same thing I was. But now I figured it out and got it answered. It just was a little bit different from those languages.
There you go. But you found the answer, so you did good. I'll put it here for now. Another note, you're more than welcome to add other cells too, by the way. So you can always add other things, try other stuff out. It's a-okay.
I had a question.
Yeah.
Once you've got the assertion in there, is there, like when you run that cell, is there a success message of any kind? Or does it just a checkbox? Is that what you're looking for?
Yep, you'll just get a checkbox. There should be no errors shown.
Oh, okay.
So technically, you could just delete everything inside of there and run it, and it wouldn't raise any errors.
That's what I did.
Oh, you found the loophole now.
So I have a question about the notebook.
Yeah.
This is my first time using it. Is it only Python based, or can you do it in any language?
For Google Colab, it's only Python based, but there are a lot of different notebook solutions that will have different languages. So
Okay.
The interpreted languages have the most support. So like Ruby, JavaScript, Python. There's other ones that will help you with compiled languages if you're doing like Java or C#. But the most common ones are Java, Ruby, and Python.
Thank you. Yeah, it's nice to be able to have that, to be able to share on it in a group like this. And
so cool, right? Yeah, I love it. And you have like markdown things too. And like what's really cool is like you can add images and whatnot. So like for example, in one of our notebooks at work, we're showing like different web performance metrics in a web scraper that we have. And we can actually display those diagrams and charts in the notebook. So it's really, really cool. And then we can share that notebook with other people and say, hey, customer, use this notebook, run this cell, and it'll grab some metrics from your website and show you a diagram of the results. So it's even really easy to share with other people that way as well. Very cool. All right, I hope you were able to complete it. If not, maybe that gives you an idea of some things you could practice. Or if maybe you're not like a Pythonista yourself, maybe give this challenge a try in the language that you prefer. Either way. But yeah, so here we really just needed to replace this deck ID with the deck ID we have from this deck, right? And this part is difficult because you have to kind of extract this deck ID value from this JSON. And if you're coming from a JavaScript background, it probably did not feel as great because in JavaScript, you would just say like deck.deckID and you would have it. It'd be that easy. Unfortunately, for basically every other language, you have to do something else. I tried to show you a hint here for how you grab things from a dictionary or from a JSON. You have to use something like this to pull it out. So let me show you how we would do that. So I'm going to hold a variable called deckID. I'm going to have this be equal to deckID, exactly how it's spelled right here. I'm going to pass in this key, give me the value for that. And now I have the deckID. Another option as well is just to say get the deckID. Both of them will work. Rightio, and then from there, we grab this placeholder and we replace it with this deckID. The last part is asserting that we drew 3 cards. So if you were to look at this, we'll look at this object here soon, but you would just say something like this, right? This would be one way to show, yeah, we drew 3 cards. Now I run the cell and I shouldn't get any errors. There we go. So this would be a solution to solving this challenge. So let's take a look at the cards object right quick. Click on this. This will show us, here's what a list of 3 cards looks like. We have a list that is shown here by the square brackets. This is how we know it's a list. And then we have a list of objects. So here's the first object right here. This would be an ace of spades, comma. Here's the second object. Mine is a 3 of diamonds. Yours is probably different, by the way. I have a 3 of diamonds as my second card. And then lastly, the last card I have is a 6 of spades. Very nice. All right, moving on. So when consuming APIs, it's very darn common to create functions as wrappers around endpoints. You might have like 2 or 3 endpoints that you have to call to achieve something, right? So let's say, for example, you create a user, you authenticate the user by like generating a token for them, and then you log in as the user. Let's say that's your flow. Instead of calling each one of these by sending request.getThis, request.postThat, request, you might just put those 3 functions inside of one bigger function that says authenticate a user, and it runs those 3 API calls for you, right? So you can kind of make these workflow or flow functions, if you will, that wrap these endpoints. So let's see an example of that. In this case, we're creating a function called create new deck. We're going to create a new shuffle deck and only return the deck ID. So instead of dealing with that whole object we had up here, which was this one, instead of dealing with all this, if all we care about is a deck ID, maybe we can have our function create a deck and only return the deck ID. So I don't have to do this, all these gymnastics just to get the deck ID. Just an example, right? So let's see what the function would look like. Here we go. Here's deck response. Looks very similar to what we have above. So there's that line, get me the deck response.json, and then return the deck ID. Moving on, here we go. Now we can use the thing. Oh, I got to run the cell. Excuse me. Run the cell so the function exists. And now run this one. There we go. So now in order for me to create a new deck, I just call my create new deck function. I can hold the deck ID that it returns in a variable and then print it out. Here we go. So challenge number 2. This is going to be a little more complicated. I need you to write a function that allows you to draw n cards from any deck. Before we had the 3 hard-coded, right? Or 2 hard-coded. So 2 before, then 3 here. Now the function needs to be able to accept any number. Scrolling back down. Any number from any deck. Use our create new deck function to create a new shuffle deck. Use your function to draw 5 cards from that deck and assert that 5 cards were drawn. That's the challenge. Throw it in here, and I'm going to give you 5 minutes to do so. Good luck. All right. I hope that was not too bad for people. Again, if so, hopefully there's a list of things for you to kind of check out, work on, or if you have another language you prefer, you get to work on that language. So here's what I did. I wrote a function that lets me draw n cards from any deck. So my function draw cards, you have to pass in a deck ID, which is a string, and then it counts for how many cards you want to draw, which is an integer in this case. Then I use my create new deck function to make a new deck. There it is. Use my custom function to draw 5 cards from it. There it is. And then make sure that I drew 5 cards. There it is. But all right. So the last part, we're not going to do this together. This is a more advanced challenge. People that were like, this is too easy, Carlos. Do this one. I think this one it will be a good one for you to try out. I think it'll be good for you for just programming practice. This advanced challenge, using the Deck of Cards API, build a console game of the popular game of war. So I wrote an article not too long ago in our QAP open source knowledge base called How to Conduct High Quality Interviews. And on this one, I added a section, where are you, friend? Challenges. And right here, it's actually one of the challenges that I like to give inside of interviews. So if you're someone who is a software developer or you want to be like a test automation engineer or whatever, and you're applying for a role, this is a very common coding challenge that I give people, and we pair on it together. And you're more than welcome to read the article to see how I kind of run this challenge, but it's a good challenge to do and see people go through it. It tells me a whole bunch. So give it a try and see if you were to take one of my interviews, would you pass it? So give it a try, and you have all of the resources that you need right here in this notebook to fill it out right here. Give it a try, have a good time, but that's the end of this notebook. So what I want to get to next, if no one has any questions, of course, what I want to get to next is dealing with more advanced APIs, right? So one that I like to use is called this demoqa.com. It shows Selenium certification training. But what I like about this website is they have this bookstore application. And it's just a dummy practice website. So you can practice your UI automation and API automation skills with this. It's just a very simple bookstore. You have some search functionality, you have some login functionality. And then if you log in, you can add books to your collection, which is pretty cool too. But you have the UI bit of it, and then you have the API bit of it. And if you actually run these APIs in here, like hit these endpoints, it will change what you see in the UI. So you can use the APIs to drive a lot of what happens in the UI, which is very close to what we actually deal with in the real world. We will do a lot of shortcuts. We call them seams in test automation. We'll do a lot of shortcuts. So that way I don't, for example, instead of me having to go to, let me just show you an example here, like login, and with Selenium or Cypress, manually type in username, manually type in password, and then click login. With the API, we can just create a user with all of this, authenticate them, and just land already signed in inside of the bookstore. So we can shortcut, avoid the login completely, and just land on the page that we care about. Also, for anyone who wants to, who's thinking about like building a portfolio, if you don't have one, this is a very good portfolio website. If you're able to use the API and use the UI to create automated tests, Very powerful, very impressive. It shows, hey, I can drive the UI with the backend APIs and control my test data in that way. Very powerful. So a good portfolio website. So let me go back to the API here. Really pretty. Look at that. You gotta love these Swagger docs, right? They're so great. In this case, we have two different accounts, or not accounts, routes. In this API, we have the account route, which is the /account v1. Told you there's versions. And then also a bookstore, so /bookstore, and to handle books and that kind of stuff as well. So someone asked about authentication. We have inside of the QA at the point, GitHub organization. You have the knowledge base repo, and then you also have an API testing with Python. We're going to be adding more. If anyone wants to contribute, please reach out because we need more contributors, more maintainers. But this one is, we're going to be adding recipes and examples and things for anyone who's doing API testing in Python. We'll put all those examples inside of here. So one of them would be auth. And right here, you have a snippet as to how you would do it, right? And it should look at this point a lot more familiar because we've gone through that notebook. So you see the base URL, you see the route, and then here's a function for us to delete the user. Now, in this API, the bookstore API, in order to delete a user, the user has to be authenticated. You have to authenticate the request. So not anybody can delete users. You have to be an authorized request in order to delete users, right? And here's how you would do so. So step number one, you would create the headers. Oops. You do this by using the authorization header and passing in the token, kind of like this. Inside of Postman, you have this headers as well, and you put the authorization bearer token here. But in Postman, they give you like a convenience method to do so. They have like an authorization section that you can do it. So you don't have to just put it inside the header object, even though technically this is where it will end up no matter what you do. They do have an authorization thing, and Bill and Matt showed this last time. Going back. So in code, you would do something closer to this, right? You'd have an object for your headers. In this case, we only have one header, which is authorization, and we're passing in this token. Here's our request URL. We're putting in the base URL plus the route, and then the path variable. All of these terms I'm talking about, you should be familiar with at this point. Step number 3, we then send the request. We're using not a get this time, we're using a .delete, right? That's the action we want because we're deleting a user. Give it the request URL, and then the headers, which includes that authentication token. And then once you're all done, in this case, we're checking to make sure that if it didn't work, we can do something with it. So if for whatever reason the delete didn't work, we would get a response that was not okay, and then we could handle the error some way. Otherwise, return the response, and we know that the user was deleted.
Carlos, how do you get the token?
So in this case, when getting a token is through this generate token endpoint. It's kind of tiny. Hold on, let me make it bigger.
We can go bigger. Create an account for that to pass the correct username and password.
Mm-hmm. So you have a username and password. This is from this one. You make a user first. You then authenticate that user using this API endpoint, the generate token.
Okay.
So you make a user first, and then when you generate a token, you use the same username and password. Not the most secure, but hey, that's okay. This is an example website. But yeah, so you make a user, then you pass in the same username and password into this function that authenticates that user, returns a token that looks kind of like this. So this is what, if it works, you'll get an object that looks like this, and this token field will have the value that you care about.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you bet. And this token here, this is just a placeholder, but it would be an actual token. That's what we're putting right here. Very nice, very nice. In the same API, in order to get a user, very similar. You have to be authenticated in order to request users. So you get a user, pass in the bearer token, very similar. I didn't put a bunch of comments for this one because it's basically the same thing. But instead of a delete, we're using a .get. But same looking thing, and then yeah, return the JSON. And in this case, in Python, a JSON is just a dictionary. So that's why you see this so it's a dictionary. But yeah, so very similar to delete. That's how you would get a user from this API. So I'm hoping that you're kind of seeing a pattern now after going through the notebook and going through the anatomy of kind of each piece to now seeing it in action, I'm going to show you one more file that shows how to kind of do this end to end, because this is just an example. This test, for example, isn't going to work. So here's a test doing everything, kind of tying these two functions together, or sorry, just deleting a user. So here we go. Test delete user with invalid data should not return 200. Right? If I try to delete a user without the right stuff, I shouldn't get a 200 back, because a 200 error code is a success error code. And so if I pass in the wrong stuff, I should not get a 200 back, or I should get something else. The docs say that I should receive a 204 unauthorized or 401 error response. And we can confirm that right here. So wait, this is the generate token. We want to look at delete. Delete. So we try to delete somebody. We have, these are the three possible ones that they show at least inside the documentation. If it works, you'll get a 200. If it doesn't work for any other reason, here's unauthorized or just a generic error, I should get one of these status code instead, right? Okay. However, it seems we've caught a bug because we get a 200 success anyway. So, hey, we caught a bug. Feels bad, but hey, that's the whole point of the test, right? So I like to split up the tests in the whole AAA, the arrange, act, and assert. So if we were to organize our tests in that fashion, arranging our data, we'd have a user ID and a token. We'd probably want to generate those things, right? Generate a real user, grab their user ID, then generate a token for them, grab the token, and replace these placeholders with those actual values. Then our act is the act of deleting the user. This is what we're testing. Delete the user with that user ID and token, grab the JSON, and now we can test some stuff out. So our first assert is, let's make sure the status code is not 200, because we expect one of these, and our test fails because we get a 200. So that first line fails. But let's say it passed. We go to the next assertion. Our code should be 1207. And that 1207, very arbitrary number, is coming from here. You get this code back. So even though the status code is 200, we get this other arbitrary number for the code. And so when I saw that as a tester, I'm like, wait a second, what the heck is this code? What is this code? Why 1207? Why not 1206? What are the other codes? These are some questions for my team. So as I'm kind of testing and automating stuff, I'm writing questions and taking notes and talking to my team about it. But yeah, what the heck is 1207? And then I would expect to say user ID is not correct because I'm passing in this regular generic thing. This is not a real token. So obviously I was expecting a message like user ID not correct. So there you go. Questions before I move on to the bigger, more integrated flow of all this?
What do you think about 204?
What was that?
What do you think about the status code 204? I feel like they should use the different status code instead of 204 for the error.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things wrong with this API. And so that would be like you saying that, like, why would they use 204? Why not this other one? I would immediately note that down and talk to the team about it. Be like, I think there's a more appropriate error code or status code to use here, because 204, I don't think is correct.
I would go like either like 401 or 403.
Yeah, and I would agree. Like, I think there's better status codes. There's better error messages. You know, like a 1207, as someone who is consuming the API, this doesn't tell me anything helpful. I don't know what 1207 means. That doesn't help me at all. And so this must be something that is for them internally, is helpful for them. But that doesn't mean they need to show me 1207. They care about 1207. As a consumer of their API, I don't care about 1207. So there's some cleanup they could do here as well. And it's one of the reasons why I was posting this question of like, what is the code for? How can we make this a better experience for the person consuming the API? Let's give them a better error message to help unblock them faster. Because right now I would see this and now I have to go email their support team. Hey, I got a 1207. I'm trying to delete a user and I can't. And now I have to email thread, go back and forth. It's a terrible developer experience with their API. So there's another quality attribute, right? The experience of using their product, their API, that we can, as testers, you know, we want to poke at, we want to try to improve as well, and giving insights into 204, I don't think is the appropriate status code. We should use a different one. Here's why. I think that's very valuable to provide to the team.
Yeah, 204 is a no content status. that doesn't determine anything about authorization or authentication.
Yep.
So you're
so look at all this information we're getting. And remember, they're docs. If this is your first time looking at the docs, you go, oh, these are the only 3 possible things. Clearly, this is going to be helpful. And then you realize, well, actually, just because these are their official docs doesn't mean that they're high quality. It doesn't mean that these are correct either or the best options. I wonder why they made that choice. I still don't know what 1207 means. There's places of improvement here. And as testers, we can help out there for sure. So good comments, good comments. All right, on to the next example here. So the next one is the flows example. And currently I have one, which is how to use data from one response to another request. Very similar to what we did inside of the notebook, but this is going to be a more realistic flow. So in this example, we're going to create a new user with one request. We'll then authorize that user with another request, which returns a bearer token. Then we'll get that user using the token from the previous request. So we're doing this chain here of 3 steps. So let's check this out. And I put this command here. So if anyone wants to clone this repo, this is completely open source. So everyone should have access to it. Feel free to clone it or fork it, whatever you want to do, and you can run the tests and try stuff out. It's pretty cool. Okay, so very similar again. Here's the base URL. Here's the route. And then I added this thing, account v1 URL. You can kind of build these however you want to, but hopefully these terms like route are starting to make sense. It's not just random jargon anymore. So let's create a user. Create a user. In order to do so, we need a username and a password. I'm not just making that up, of course. This comes from their API. So that would be this one. Post this endpoint, you pass in a username and password payload, and that should create a user in the database. So here we go. So here's a payload. Now, for post requests, because you're creating something, it's very common for you to add a payload or a body to the request that you're going to be adding to the database. All right. So in this case, our payload is going to be this. We have username, whatever username we pass in here. And then our password is going to be whatever password we pass in here. Okay, there's our payload. And then request.post, because this is a post action. Hit our endpoint with /user at the end. And for the JSON, let's pass in our payload. We'll get a response back. We can handle the response however we want to, in case we get an error, for example. And then once we're done, we can return the JSON back in this case. And now we have a user. The next part is to authenticate a user by generating a token. Generate an auth token for the user with the given username and password. So there's our username and password again, just like this function, username and password. Notice that the route is the same, but the endpoint /generate token is different. Right? So instead of saying /user here, we're saying /generate token, but everything else is basically the same. A pattern arises. Fantastic. That makes it easier, right? Once there's a pattern, it simplifies a lot of things. Okay, now here's this one. This is going to be one of those flow functions I'm talking about, where we're going to use 2 different API calls in the same function. So it's going to be a very common use case for me to create an authorized user, right? So instead of me having to call these 2 functions every single time, create a user, then generate token, create a user, then generate token, I can just make one function called create an authorized user that creates a user and then generates the token and return the user and token back. Moving on. Now we have our get user function. We saw this in the previous example. So there's user ID and our token. There's the headers for the authorization, send it, bada bing, bada boom. And now here's the new bits that we haven't seen yet. In Python, when you're doing test automation, the most common library to use, or framework, I should say, is called pytest. There's another one called unit test as well. PyTest is better though, just use PyTest. And in PyTest, you have the concept of a fixture function. A fixture function is a special function that has a setup and a teardown attached to it. So one function that will do a setup either before each test or before all tests, or you're probably familiar with those kind of terms if you come from like C# or Java, even JavaScript, like before each, after each, before all, after all, you know, those kind of words. In Python, we just use fixtures and a single function will handle both of those things. Very powerful, very cool, and you build Lego blocks from them. That's out of the scope of this workshop, but just know that fixtures is what does the before and after for the tests. Okay, in this API, a username must be unique. but the password doesn't matter. So if I were to use the same username every single time, the first time I run my tests, the test would pass. The second time I run my tests, the test would fail because the username or the user already exists in the database. So we want to be able to create credentials, username and password combination, that are unique every time. So that way my test data doesn't trip each other up. So in this case, I'm going to use a library called Faker, which just like it sounds like, it generates fake data. So for my username, let me generate a dynamic first name plus a dynamic last name. For my password, it doesn't have to be unique, so I'll just use this one for now. But you could say fake.password and it would generate a fake password too. Yeah, oh, that got weird. There we go. And then once this is done, return the username and password back.
Isn't that likely to hit a duplicate when it's like John Smith gets generated by the Faker library?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to add other things, like this is just an example. So you can add a bunch of other things if you want. If you want to do a fake GUID or not even fake GUID, just a GUID. You could do all sorts of things. Here I'm just showing that you can create dynamic fake data. It's a massive list, so it'd be very hard for it to create the same one, but it's very possible. It's possible
one thing we do is we take
finite list.
Today's date and then we kind of make that the string when we use the time as well, and you can put that down to milliseconds if you really wanted to, and that way it's kind of time stamping exactly when the account was created. Yep, and anything like that to dynamically create something that is not the static thing. So exactly right. And you probably have a bunch of tests around that too, because I don't know what the rules are for your username or your passwords. You probably are going to be testing those things too. So there's a whole lot that you can do. But here, the example that's trying to show is that you generate something dynamic instead of having something hard-coded like this. So then your test data does not trip over each other. So if your username allows for timestamps like that, that's a great way to make something unique. Because if you go down to the milliseconds, it would be very unlikely that two tests will have the same timestamp. Someone is asking, is Faker internal class in Python? No, Faker is a library that almost every language has. So it's a single library, but they ported it to other languages. So JavaScript has access to it. Java does too, but I think Java had the whole log4j thing that like kicked it in the butt. Yeah, most languages will have the Faker library. Okay, now that we have this credentials fixture, this will, before every single test, it will generate random credentials. We'll get unique credentials every time, and then our tests won't trip over each other. So the way that we use that in PyTest is just by passing it. Here's a test. Test get newly created user. You pass in the credentials, and then you can use it here. So if we go back into the organizing it in arrange, act, and assert, arrange, let's get our username and password. There you go. I'm unpacking it just so then it's a little more readable, but we could do without this line. So here's my username and password from my credentials fixture. Let's do the act of creating an authorized user. Given that username and password, now we have the new user token, or the new user and their token as well. Extract the user ID and token to be used in the next API call. So new user.get the user ID, new token.get the token, and now we can get that user using that information. And asserts, in this case, or this is a random assertion, the user that we created, their username should match what we found inside of our database as well. So we know that they exist in the database now because of this line.
Just want to be clear, this is for running against a live server, right?
In this one, yes, because this currently is live. So this is one that is up and running. If you were doing it locally, you would want your web server to be running. You could also just do unit tests that test the functions themselves, not the running web server.
Sure.
So you could do that as well.
How long do they keep the data over there?
I actually don't know. That's a great question. I haven't asked.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Like maybe like a couple of days, just a week.
Yeah, maybe. Like the deck of cards API, I think they flush it every 7 days.
Oh, okay.
For this one, I'm not sure. Maybe it's something similar, maybe 24 hours, something like that. But it's another good reason to have dynamic data, so then you're not dependent on their database. Now, driving the UI with the APIs is out of the scope of this workshop, but it is one that we can do if you do want to see how we can use all of these API functions we're creating to drive the UI. We can do that in a different workshop if anyone is interested.
I have a question on,
Yes.
you mentioned use these to drive the API, the UI. Do you mean the example you said where you use the API call to get your token, so you don't have to, you can skip the login through the UI, and now you do what you actually want to with the UI?
Yep.
Okay.
So let me, I want to say I have it. I gotta have this. I'm in my API, haha, UI, fantastic. So let's do this login one. So here you go. So this is what a test would look like. This is using Pylenium. This is the tool that I built for Python. But this is using Pylenium. If you want to log in without that, this should look pretty similar to anyone who knows like Selenium or Cypress. You should be able to read this. But we make an unauthorized user to log in with. So we're going to visit demoqa.com/login, get the username field, type in these credentials, type in the password, then click login, and the next page should contain username, right? Something like that. With the seam, we have this login seam. I'll show you what this looks like, but I'll show you what this looks like soon. But in this case, we have the user. We're able to just log in and land on the profile page and immediately just check that the username is there. In this case, I'm using the login seam to go to the books page and check that Git Pocket Guide exists on the page. So we're able to bypass this whole bit right here.
Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah, you bet. And I'll show you what this code looks like. All right, meow. Yes, I said meow, don't judge me. Okay, so right here, this login one, we need this new authorized user for this website. The way that they authenticate after you get the token is you have to set a cookie on the browser. So that's what this is doing right here, right? So once we have our new authorized user, there's the user and token that you saw before. We go to the login page because we have to set cookies. So we have to start somewhere on their website. We then set the cookies. There's a username, the user ID, the token, and it expires. This is what they care about for this website specifically. And then from there, we can land on any page we care about.
Why do we need to set the cookies?
It's how their website is, that's how they track their user, is by setting these 4 cookies.
But when you log in, they're supposed to set those, right?
When you log in, you pass in your username and password.
Right.
They then send, you clicking the login button will then send that generate token request.
Mm-hmm.
So that gets sent. If everything passes, it returns the token. You then get past the login screen. These 4 cookies get added, and then you land on your profile page or your book collection page.
But doesn't the page do that?
Well, if I go through the login flow manually, yes, but this will skip the login flow.
Oh, okay.
Right, because this is the API call. Like this is me hitting the API. I generate a new authorized user.
Okay, you are skipping that. Okay.
I'm skipping the login screen.
Okay. Thanks for the explanation.
Yeah, no problem. Some websites will be different, by the way. This is just how they do it. You have to have these 4 cookies set in order to bypass the login. That's how you authenticate on their website. Your website might be a little bit different. So if you're unsure how to create a login seam, I'd ask one of your devs, like, hey, what API call do I hit? What do I have to add to it? They might say, here's a cookie you have to add. You go, oh, cool. Or they might have a different way for you to authenticate. But usually you'll have a login seam. It's a very common one because you may have like OAuth, you may have like CAPTCHAs, or you may have like other things like that you want to make sure you disable or are able to get through. So a login seam is a very common one. Maybe call it like an auth seam would make sense as well. But you create a user, you authenticate, and then you disable anything that would prevent you from logging in, like a CAPTCHA, which is not meant to be automated. So you want to disable that, and then you can land on the place you care about. Just shortcut your way there without having to navigate the browser with Selenium or Cypress. Very nice, very nice. In this function here, you can see that I'm able to even make like users with books. So once I know how to make a user, I'm able to then say like, I want a new authorized user, but I also want to give them books. So now I have a fixture for if I want a user that has books already attached to them, I would use this fixture. All right, so you can see how you kind of build on top of what you're creating. And I can have a user that's not authorized. I can create authorized users. I can create users with 20 books. I can create users with no books. You have a lot of control because you're using code in this way. Big advantage over what you can do in Postman, for example. All right, all right. Oh, sorry, I didn't see your chat there. But for consecutive requests, you need to set the cookies again, right? Or will it carry over, like get it from the response and add it to future requests? It depends on how you write the tests. So let me see how I can explain that a little bit better. Nope, that didn't go where I want. Let's see here. So right here we have these two tests, right? So these two tests, both of them use the login theme. One of them lands on profile, the other one lands on books. The way that these tests are currently written, each one of these tests will get a completely different browser with a completely different user, meaning they'll both use the login theme and both will add cookies, right? The benefit of that is I can run either of them however I want to. I can run them concurrently or in parallel. I can run one of them and it's okay. I don't have to run both of them. They just won't trip over each other ever, which is really nice. However, you can make it so then you have like these two tests run sequentially using the same user if you want to, right? So let me make one user, log in with them, check something here that like I landed on their profile page. Then let me click on the books screen. Let me add a book. And maybe the second test is dealing with the books. So you can do that where the tests are dependent on each other or dependent on the same test data. I don't recommend doing that. There's a lot of problems with that. One of them being you can't run the tests in parallel anymore, which is the biggest disadvantage. But you can do so. And there are scenarios where it would make sense for you to share data across tests or have tests dependent on each other. I have never run into that situation yet, but I'm sure there's a scenario where you would want that. So I don't want to generalize and say it's best practice to never, because I don't know all of the scenarios. But from my experience, it's best if the tests are independent of each other. If you're using Pylenium, it will almost force you to write your tests in a way where they are independent. So it's very difficult to write your tests so they are dependent on each other. I designed it on purpose. I designed it like that on purpose. All right, I'll stop sharing. You're more than welcome to bounce for now at this point. We have the monthly meetup next week. That will be hybrid. So if you're in Utah, we'll be meeting at PDQ. Make sure you check out like the general and Curate the Point channels for more information on that, or just meetup.com. That works too. If you are remote, we will provide a Zoom link as well. So don't worry, even though we are meeting in person, we'll also have the remote option as well. But otherwise, that's about it. So thanks y'all for joining. If you want to hang out and ask other questions or talk about anything else, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, have yourselves a quality night.